Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of the entire Wisconsin Facet staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is entitled Introduction to Basic Communication. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you our presenter for today, Heidi Hollenberger. Heidi is the Deafblind Specialist for the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project and the Deafblind Consultant for the Wisconsin Education Services Program for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Outreach. She has been serving deafblind children in Wisconsin for the past 14 years. Heidi is duly licensed as a teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing and a teacher for the blind and visually impaired. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Heidi Hollenberger. Heidi?
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you for everyone who's joining us today and anybody who might be joining us later if they're listening to this archived. Don't let my title scare anybody away. I am a deafblind specialist. I work with children who have combined vision and hearing loss, aged birth to 21. But what I'm going to talk about today is basic communication, which is really for any individual who is at the communication level of 24 months and younger. Every single individual, regardless of ability, disability, it doesn't matter, they all go through these same steps of communication and learning communication. Some of our kids who do not have additional challenges sort of burn through these phases a lot faster than some of our kids who have less access to their environments due to physical challenges, intellectual challenges, or sensory as far as deaf and or deafblind. So I am going to be talking today about a tool that I specifically have been using for probably the entire 14 years that I have been in this role. And it is called the Communication Matrix, and it is written by Charity Rowland. And at the end of this presentation, I'll give a demo. It is available online at no cost. So I would like anybody that wants to try it out on their own after the webinar, they are more than welcome to do that. You just register with them and you just use it, go through and answer the questions, and the best of your ability with the child or the individual that you want to evaluate or assess just to find out where they fall in their communication development. It's very simple to use, in my opinion. So the Communication Matrix is really, like I said before, it's a communication skill assessment, and it's for individuals at the earliest stages of communication development. And it's for individuals who use any form of communication. It can be pre-symbolic, meaning that they're not using formal words, they're not using pictures, they're not using object cues, for example, or any alternative and augmentative forms. So it really is for kids that also use other forms of communication to get their wants and needs communicated. Why we communicate. First step we talk about is why do we communicate? And really everybody communicates for the very same reason. We communicate to refuse things that you don't want. We communicate to obtain things that you do want. We communicate to engage in social interactions. And we communicate to provide or seek information. And communication develops sort of in that linear. We start out by refusals. Most of you probably can say, if you've worked with a student or you have your own child who is in those earlier stages of communication, it seems like the refusals and protests are those first to emerge. You really know what it is they don't like or what it is they really don't want. They make that pretty obvious. And then it goes on to the obtaining. So whether they're asking for something specific that they want to interact with, they want you to do something to them. So maybe they're sitting on your lap and they start bouncing. They're telling you that they want you to bounce them on their knees. So they're asking for something to happen to them. They also, in that same line of obtaining, is asking for continuation of an activity. So when you stop doing something with them, so if you're bouncing them on your knee and you stop bouncing, do they do something with their body Or do they do a vocalization or a movement, or do they look at you that tells you they want you to continue that activity? So that also falls under the obtain. And then of course there's the social interactions, which includes, the eye contact, pointing, getting you to engage in sort of a joint attention where you're both focusing on the same, I'm going to say topic in air quotes, because a topic can also be an object. It doesn't have to be a verbal topic. And then seeking additional information, as I mentioned before. So when we use this tool, we always start with the refuse and we work our way through the other major reasons for communicating. So I have a paper copy that I use, and actually I use it enough now that I don't even need to take it along with me. So with the paper copy, as you'll see when we also do the demo online, they go through and they ask questions. And as you answer your questions, then you will be asked additional questions until you no longer can answer those questions. It comes up with a no. Either the child completes all of them and they have formal communication, or you'll stop because they're only partway through the development. And so what I'm saying is, for example, can you tell when your child is uncomfortable, in pain, wet, hungry, or startled? So this is just the expresses discomfort part. And so then you'll say yes, or you'll answer no. And if you answer no, then there isn't any reason to continue asking any more questions on this page, because developmentally you need to be able to tell that they're expressing discomfort before you can tell when they don't want something specific, like a toy or a food or a game. And so what you'll look for in expressing discomfort, so can you tell when your child is uncomfortable? They'll ask, how do you know that? Does their body stiffen? Does their body twist? Do they turn away? Are you seeing limb movements like a kicking legs or batting arms? Do they turn their head away? Does their facial expression change? Are they grunting or crying or screaming, a vocalization? So they give you cues to help you be able to identify whether or not you're able to tell whether or not the child expresses discomfort. And if the answer is yes, then you get to go to the second question, which is protest. Can you tell when your child doesn't want something specific, such as a certain toy or a game you're playing, like tickling? And if you answer no, then you're done with this page. But if you answer yes, then again, is it a head movement? Do they turn away, pull back their head? Is it an arm movement, a leg movement, a facial expression? What is it that they do that says they don't like what it is I am doing right now? And so if you can answer that question, then there's another question. So there's a series of questions that go with each one of these areas of communication. So there's also, when we're looking at this, it goes through.
So Heidi, we're having a little trouble with your PowerPoint.
Yeah.
You might want to go to start it again. I don't know if everybody can see it.
It is not, when I arrow through, oh, there it goes, sorry.
There you go. Nope.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's where I was talking about, so the refusal, the obtain, the social, and the seek additional information. So do they want me to start totally over?
Nope, that's fine. You're fine where you are right now, just so that we can advance from there.
Yeah, so we were talking about the refusal, the obtain things you want, social interactions, and the seek additional information. And I was talking a little bit about the difference between the symbolic versus pre-symbolic. So the pre-symbolic is vocalizations, gestures, body language, facial expression. Those are all things that we're going based on just sort of observing them, what we see. And symbolic is more the spoken language, sign language, and Braille. It's the more formal parts of communication. So then I was just getting to this part. So we talk about the communication competence, and communication competence falls into these sort of 7 levels. Although I say 7 levels, but you'll find out a little bit later that 2 of those sort of overlap a little bit. So when we're looking at this, we have our pre-intentional behaviors. And our pre-intentional behaviors are those that are reflexive or reactive. They're not purposeful. They're typically associated with well-being, like they're hungry or they're in pain. So I think of our, like the newborn stage. This is where you're sort of trying to guess what their behaviors are trying to tell you. And as parents get savvier, they start to figure out and distinguish the differences in those vocalizations or in those behaviors to know whether a child is in pain versus that they're hungry. But in the very beginning, it's just that reflexive or reactive. They are not doing it because they know that they're telling somebody something. They just do it because that's just the reaction that they have. And I would say at this part, we talk about, I'll talk about this actually throughout the whole thing. The most important role that we play as adults when we're engaging with children who are at the earliest levels of communication is what I call responsive partnerships. I wish that was my term, but it's not. Responsive partnerships mean when you notice a child is trying to communicate, whether it is pre-intentional is where the child starts to learn that if I cry, somebody is going to show up. So the more times that you respond to their communication, it starts to move into the intentional behavior. But they'll stay at the pre-intentional until they start to recognize that they do have control over somebody else's behavior. And so that will lead us into the intentional behaviors. So the behaviors are intentional. So this is where it gets a little tricky. The behaviors are intentional, but they're not intentionally communicative. So they know that they are crying because they are hungry, but they're not intentionally communicating that to another person. They have that understanding that this one's always the one that gets me stuck up. This is the one where parents interpret the behavior as communication and respond accordingly. So this is really where the responsive partnership comes into play really big. I don't want to say bigly. Comes in really big here. So this is where the parents are interpreting the behavior as communication and they respond. So this is where where you start to attach meaning. And this might even be where you'll say, oh baby, you're hungry, or oh, I see, oh, you have an owie on your finger. You're telling me that you've got an owie. And so that's then labeling what it is that you recognize that behavior to start looking like so that the child can start to mold their communication to specifically let you know what it is that they're trying to tell you. And then, oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Then we run into the unconventional communication. And the unconventional communication is the most critical step in the communication development. This is where kids start to bridge over, and this is where the communication becomes intentional. They now know that they can exert control over someone else's behavior in response to their behavior, in response to their communication. So this is where, when we're using preferred activities, we attach language to their responses so that we can model appropriate and conventional communication. Because unconventional communication really sort of means that it is not like adult appropriate behavior. So these are the kids that throw things when they don't like them. These are kids that when you put a bite of food in their mouth and they don't like it, they spit it out. You have to think unconventional means that it is not a behavior that you want to carry into adulthood. We want to start molding it and changing it so it becomes more conventional, which is the next step. So this is using those rewards, those positive reinforcements, the praise. All of those things are really very important when we're talking about this part. Let's see. So when we get into the conventional communication, this is socially acceptable. This is where we start using those gestures. We have the vocalizations. This is where kids are nodding and shaking their head. They're looking at you while they're pointing to a bottle on the floor. And this can continue throughout adulthood as socially acceptable. And this is where we talk about that dual orientation, that joint attention where you're paying attention to the same topic. When we talk about the concrete symbols, we're now getting into more of different forms of communication. So concrete symbols are representations. And sometimes I think this is where people tend to jump to we have kids sometimes that are still in pre-intentional behaviors. They have the intentional behaviors but not intentional communication, and people are moving up to those concrete symbols without worrying about the stuff that happens between, the stuff that happens in the middle. Because kids need to understand that it's a representation. So I oftentimes do an activity, and I'm going to try to see if I can describe it. It certainly does better if you can see me in person, but we talk about if I take an apple, and I have an apple, and I call it an apple, a child can hold the apple, smell the apple, taste the apple. That's the object. That's the actual object. That is, gives the most information about an object, is the actual object itself. Once the child can see and hold and touch the apple, and you know that they understand that it's an apple, then I cut it in half. It still is an apple, kind of, but it loses some of its descriptors. So it's no longer round. It probably certainly smells different once it's cut open versus when it's whole. It still tastes the same. It's still the same color. It just might be two colors now because the inside of the apple is more of a yellowish white and the outside is red, green, yellow, whatever color apple you have. So it still is a pretty good representation of the actual object, but it is what we call a partial object. And then sort of the next part we go to is people will usually jump to taking a picture of that apple. Well, once you take a picture of that apple, the only representation that still is the same to the actual apple itself might be its color. It doesn't have the shape anymore. We've now gone from three-dimensional to two-dimensional. It certainly doesn't have a smell. It certainly doesn't have a taste. So it's a big step to go from an actual object to like a picture representation. And then it's an even a bigger step to go from an actual object to symbol recognition, which is like APPLE. When you see those letters APPLE or the sign for apple or Braille for apple, it doesn't look anything at all like an apple. There's nothing about that that looks like an apple. So that's where, when we get to those concrete symbols, it's really important to start with those whole objects before we start moving into the more abstract symbols, just because the representation it's a big leap for some kids. Some other representations that we might talk about for concrete symbols are kids that might use nodding their head for yes. So it's those gestures that are representative. So nodding their head for yes, shaking their head for no, pointing, sometimes doing a pantomime. So sometimes you'll have a kid that will, even like the sign for eat is almost a pantomime for what it looks like when you're eating. And then we talk about those tangible symbols, with the tangible symbols being those object representations that we were talking about a little bit earlier. So then when we move into the abstract symbols, that is certainly, that's the speech, the sign language, the brailled words, or graphic symbols. The child has to understand the concrete symbol before we can get to the abstract symbol. So it's, again, we'll go back to saying it's really important that each one of these things happen in order of succession. And what ends up happening is if we miss, if we jump around or we miss it, so like if we go from intentional behaviors right to an abstract symbol, that's a big leap for some of our kids without filling in the inner stuff, especially kids that don't have, you know, mobility, independent mobility to be able to do independent exploration on their own, or kids who are blind, who don't necessarily have access visually to be able to see those objects, to be able to pair a word to what it is that they see. So it's just important to keep going through in successive order, and that's where I find the communication matrix does a really nice job of breaking it down into very simple steps, because the last part is language, and language is using symbols in 2 or 3 symbol combinations. They follow grammatical rules or syntax, and when we talk about these, when we talk about the using symbols in 2 or 3 symbol combinations, those can also include, they can include kids that use augmentative communication, whether it is a communication application or like a what we call a Dynavox, when they're using any of those, that also is included when they're looking through this communication matrix. So it does not just look at spoken language or just look at sign language, for example. And so when I go back to the communication matrix, and again, I'll show you this a little bit in the demo, it'll give you a better idea. It goes through then each one of those levels. So when I'm going to go back to ways to refuse things you don't want. So when we talked about expressing discomfort, can you tell when your child is uncomfortable, in pain, wet, hungry, or startled? If you answer yes, then you say, what is the communicative behavior? What do they do that tells you that that's what they're doing? So it's, or that's what they're telling you. So is it a facial expression, a vocalization? I would say, oh, it's a vocalization. I can tell by their grunt or by their cry that they're hungry. So I will circle on here it's vocalizations. So then it goes on to the next question where it's protests. Can you tell when your child doesn't want something specific? If you answer yes, then you go over and you'll say, okay, it's because of their facial expression. They frown when I do this specific activity with them. And if you answer yes to that, you know that their behavior is intentional. They're not necessarily communicating yet, but it's intentional. So it goes back to, we're looking at each one of these levels. Now when you look at the third question, it'll say, does your child intentionally know or intentionally show you that he or she doesn't want a certain thing or a certain activity? And then that's where you start getting into that unconventional communication. Or maybe our kids, it's not unconventional. This is where I said some of it crosses over a little bit because maybe it's a leg movement or turns their head away to the side. But the conventional form would be they give you the unwanted item. So rather than throwing it, they just hand it back to you. Rather than batting at you, they shake their head no. So this is where you start getting into the more of that conventional communication. So these are, so again, the communication matrix I think does a really nice job of going through each one of those steps very simply. So we talk about the strategies for developing language. These are what I talked about a little bit more. So it's really those responsive partnerships. It's engaging in those preferred activities. So it is finding things that the child really likes, what's really motivating for them. Because otherwise what I see is the protests become very clear and very obvious, but then we don't really see intentional communication except for in those protesting stages. Because our kids are really very good at protesting and telling us what it is that they don't like. And that doesn't change. I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. They're still very good at protesting and telling me what it is that they don't like. So the responsive partnerships, and that's with anybody. So the more communication partners they can have throughout a day, you know, the more opportunities they have to practice their communication and to be able to fine-tune and hone in on how do I get my message across, who's responding, how are they responding, what do I have to do to get them to pay attention to what it is I'm trying to tell them. What happens when people stop responding is kids stop communicating. So there isn't a purpose for it if people aren't responding to it. And so then we sort of stay in that pre-intentional sort of mode for an extended period of time. On here I talk about a preferences inventory, and a preferences inventory is something that I recommend to both families and to professionals. This is taking an inventory of just something very simple that says likes and dislikes. So what are the things that the child likes? Does the child like to bounce? Does the child like to swing? Does the child like textures that are bumpy? Do they prefer soft textures? What are those things that they really like that we can use to create preferred activities that a child wants to engage in that develops that communication? So how do we get them to ask for continuation of an activity? How do we get them, it's great, asking for a continuation of an activity actually comes pretty quickly because they can do that with body motion. But what I find oftentimes, and this is what families will tell me too, is the kids don't ever request you to initiate an activity. Or if they do initiate an activity on their own, sometimes we don't know what it is that they're specifically asking for, depending on what their challenges are. So this is where making activities accessible to them. So when people start talking about putting in choices and options and using some of those object cues, the real object cues. So if your child likes to play with, or likes to play peekaboo, for example, using a blanket, then you would have a whole object of a blanket. And so when you show the blanket, maybe the child grabs the blanket and covers their face. So it tells you that they know what peekaboo is. That's starting to do some of that anticipation, which is important when we're talking about communication development too. Anticipation is where you know that they know what's going to come next. So this is the kid, like, for example, that I was working with yesterday, and I started at their foot, and I just walked my fingers, you guys have all done this at some point, walked my fingers up their calf, or up their shin, and up to their knee, and as I get closer to the top of the knee where it's tickly, I'm like, do, 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 and they're waiting for me, and you watch their facial expressions change. They kind of pull their legs back in, they giggle, because they're anticipating what it is I'm going to be doing. So I'm working with this child, I'm getting her engaged in this activity, because the activity, by her facial expression, tells me she likes it. When she giggles, it tells me that she likes it. When she puts her leg back out for me to do it again, it tells me that she's asking for a continuation of an activity. And so now we have what's called a turn-taking communication. We're having a conversation. We're taking turns. I'm doing the activity on her body, and then she in turn needs to tell me that she wants me to continue or she wants me to stop. And oftentimes the stop is they just don't ask anymore. She won't put her leg out. She won't smile in response. She doesn't start showing that anticipation. And then it's my job to look at her and say, oh, I can see you're all done with this activity. And with the all done, that's where I might introduce the sign language for all done. We might have some sort of a touch cue. Maybe somebody has developed, you tap the back of her hand 2 times. That means all done. But it's important to continue to give them that language and be able to give them a way to say all done. Because not everybody is going to recognize that she's all done. And if they keep going with that activity and she doesn't want it, then it becomes a negative experience, and then you may not have that activity to be able to play again. She may put that into a bad pile, and then you don't have that nice, rich, fun activity to use to be able to practice communication. So it's the opportunities for good social language models. So sometimes it's really hard. Some of our kids with the most challenges are also medically fragile, and so it can be a little frightening to have them in a situation where they're around other children where there can be potentially, germs, and the child can get ill and sometimes severely ill. But it is important for them to have those good social language models. Our kids always learn best from other kids, and it seems like the littler they are, the more almost accommodating. I think little kids are pretty darn accommodating. They will continue to try to play with a child who may not be the best communicator, but they don't care. They still enjoy touching and showing and using those words that typical 2- and 3-year-olds use. As adults, we're great adult language models, but we're not great social models necessarily. And so then it's, again, modeling appropriate communication interactions. This is one I talk about quite a bit too. When we talk about appropriate communication interactions and modeling them, the modeling is our kids don't always see communication happening. It might be occurring around them, but unless somebody's like physically interacting with them, sometimes physically touching them, they don't realize that the communication is for them, that they are part of that interaction. And so sometimes they just don't really pay attention to what's going on around them because it's not important, it's not touching me. They're very on body often. And so when we start introducing things like switches and augmentative communication, and we're introducing sign language, for example, if they're not seeing other people using it, it doesn't always make sense to them. So my kids, for example, again, they're 9 and 11, they still look to language models and to communication models. And sometimes it's their peers, and on the bus, sometimes it's older peers, and I wouldn't necessarily put that in the appropriate communication interactions, but they are still learning socially from their peers. Even if I don't like it, they're still learning their communications with their peers. So it's just important that we continue to model, and if there are peers that can model using the same form of communication, that is great too. So if a child is using a switch, for example, or using a voice output system, if there's somebody else that can be using it with them, a peer, that is often very motivating for our kids. So I usually am very long-winded. I had to figure out how to make this presentation be an hour long when normally it's about 3 hours. And I think that I actually cut it way too short. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to do the demo. And then I'll take questions, and I'm happy to clarify anything that anybody wants to know or any more example. So this demo, so we're hoping this will work. They do always ask for a donation. I haven't done it yet. I probably should. I use this enough. So here is the communication matrix. It is www.communicationmatrix.org. I'm already signed in as myself. So if I come down here, a free assessment tool created to help families and professionals easily understand the communication status, progress, and unique needs of anyone functioning at the early stages of communication or using forms of communication other than speaking or writing. So if we go to the Try the Matrix, I'm going to skip the registering. So if I go through, and I'm going to keep in mind, I just saw a student yesterday, so I am going to have this student in mind while I am doing this. So I am assessing an individual. It's not my child. I'm assessing just an individual. So next, statement A. This individual does not seem to have real control over their body yet. The only way I know that he wants something is because he fusses or whines when he's unhappy or uncomfortable, and he smiles, makes noises, or calms down when he's happy and comfortable. Does this statement describe this individual? So either yes, which puts us at the very basic communication, or no, the stage is beyond this individual's ability, or no, this individual has surpassed this stage. And the student I saw yesterday has already surpassed that stage. This individual has control over their own behavior, but they don't use them to try to communicate to me. She doesn't come to me to let me know what she wants, but it's easy for me to figure out because she tries to do things for herself. She knows what she wants, and her behavior shows me what she wants. If she runs out of something to eat, she will just try to get more rather than trying to get me to give her more. Does this statement describe this individual? And I would say for the individual that I saw yesterday that this does describe that individual. So then they'll give me some pictures. So now we're looking at the protests. Can you tell that this individual doesn't want some specific thing, such as a certain food or a toy or a game that I'm liking? So this is really just looking at what do we know about the student that we're working with. So there are some videos embedded. I'm not going to click on it because I don't know what is going to happen through the webinar, if it will mess things up. So I'm going to say that yes, I can tell that he doesn't want something specific. And then what does he do that tells me that he doesn't like it? So did I see, these were some of those examples I was talking about. Am I seeing body movements? So are the head movements? Are they turning their head away? Is he pulling his head back? And that is what I saw, like in this picture up here, he's pulling his head back, turning away. So if I'm talking about the student that I saw yesterday, did not use the head movements, did use, has mastered the arm movements, has also mastered the leg movements. She continually kicked my hand away when she didn't like what I was doing. She is not able to move away from a person or an object, so she does not use that. Whine, fuss, or scream. She has mastered that, although she does use some words in isolation, so I'm putting those down too. Facial expressions, those I would say are, I'm going to just say emerging because she doesn't use them consistently enough. Then down here I might have a comment, and I'll say, student is in wheelchair and prefers to lay on the mat on the floor. So for me, it'll tell me that she's in the, that just gives me additional information about her, so when I go back I can remember. And for me, for communication, that's important because in the wheelchair she does much more protesting because that's not where she wants to be. So if I want to actually see and work on communication, sometimes it is better to do the laying on the floor with her. I will actually see what her skills are and not necessarily how she's feeling because she is in a position that she doesn't like. So this was asking, do they ask for a continue in action? Can you sometimes tell that this individual would like to continue an action or an activity that you've just stopped doing? So in this case, the student did it. And for her, she would take my hands and manipulate my hands to get what she wanted for me to do. So like if I did that tickling, she would, and she could reach me, she would take my hand and she would put it on her foot. So it would tell me that she wanted me to do those hand movements. So this goes through and it goes on and on. And that is just for the sake of doing, I'll show you a few more. And then we can take some questions. I just want you a good idea of how this works. I would like to see if we can get to the next one. So I'm going to make it up. We'll just say it's emerging, and we're starting to hear the cooing and fussing. She's really good at fussing. And then I'll do a next. And so they'll keep going through. Can you sometimes tell that an individual wants more of something specific? I'm going to say no. And I'm going to say, does the individual do certain things that attract your attention to him even though she isn't purposefully trying to get your attention? I'm going to say no. And so this is just, then it goes through the statement C. So what it does is it goes all the way through, and I want to see, I'm just going to say no. And this is what it ends up looking like when you're all done. So you have your communication matrix, and this is what it looks like. And if you see over here, here are the levels I was talking about. So here's pre-intentional. Behavior is not under the individual's own control. And then it goes across, expresses discomfort, and if you see it's shaded gray, that means they've already surpassed it. Expresses comfort, already surpassed it. Expresses interest in other people, surpassed it. So then we get to it and we're looking at intentional behavior, and this is where it's under the individual's control but not yet used to communicate intentionally. So we were talking about those protests, and so this is showing that it's mastered, protesting and continuing an action. But when we get to here, it's the not used, and that's where I answered the question that it surpassed the child's ability. But if I had checked the emerging one, which was the middle circle on a lot of those, then some of these would turn yellow. So if I would have gone through the entire communication matrix, what you will see is just a smattering of gray and orange and yellow and white. So you can go through and you can then print this out, and you will see exactly where the student is currently in their communication development, what seems to be emerging, because that's what you can write as IEP goals, IFSP goals, or just your own goals at home. You don't even have to have them as anything as formal as an IFSP or an IEP. And then you have the ones that are mastered, so you already know the child has a skill, or surpassed, it means like way past it. So if you look at the bottom, it's your refusals. These are to obtain. And you'll notice that as we move down from the level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, it continues to add on. So this is just a continuous in action, obtain more of something. But once we get to an unconventional communication, which I mentioned was like that critical, sort of that critical bridge in communication development, this is where they're refusing or rejecting, requesting more, so under refusals, these are all the same for refusals, refuses and reject. But when we're looking at obtaining, requests more action, so that's the continuation of an activity, requests a new action, so maybe that's where they're not asking you to bounce them anymore. Now they want you to sway them from side to side on your knees, so they're requesting a new action. Requests more of an object, so if you're playing with an object with them, what do they do that tells you that they want more of that object? They're making choices and they're requesting new objects. And sometimes I often have kids on this third level. It seems like almost the longest amount of time. So like sometimes our kids can be here at level 3 for years before we get into more of that conventional communication. And I say the reason that is unconventional communication, like the throwing or the batting or the spitting out of the food, for example, they're very effective. People respond to them very quickly and very efficiently. So sometimes it's more work for the child to have to say no thank you, or to shake their head, or to use a switch that says no. So we sometimes get stuck in this unconventional communication for a while, and it's just because it is so darn effective. And you'll see for social, it's requesting attention. So you might have a kid that my daughters used to slap my face when they wanted me to look at them. You know, if I was holding them in my arm, and if I wasn't paying attention to them, if I was talking to somebody else, they would either pull my face toward them, or they would, you know, bat at my lips because they wanted me to be paying attention to them. And then we also have the shows affection. This is always really, I think, profound for parents who maybe get so busy being a caretaker that it's hard sometimes to sort of take that deep breath and to be able to notice that their child is showing that affection. And so I think this is also very important for parents and family members as caregivers. So when we get to the conventional communication, this is again that socially acceptable. These, as far as refusals and obtaining, are the same. They don't change again until we get to level 5. When we get to level 5, this is sort of that request absent object. So we talk about when kids know that when something is hidden or away, that it still is there. So it's object permanent. So they know that it still exists even though they can't touch it or they can't see it or anything like that. So it adds that other element as we move up into the abstract and then into language. When we look at social, the attracting attention, so it could be the scream or a yell or something that they know that you're going to turn and look at them. We're getting to that request attention, shows affection. But then again, level 4, which is conventional, we start getting into greetings, offers and sharing, directing your attention to something, polite social forms. And those continue all the way down. It just depends on whether or not they're using concrete symbols, which again are those whole objects. And you'll see up here on the little narrative above, it says most individuals skip this stage and go directly to level 6. But for some individuals, concrete symbols may be the only symbol that makes sense to them. So that's where I was talking about that a little bit, that for some kids we need to use these concrete symbols, and sometimes we need to use them longer than we maybe think we need to use them, because the abstract symbols are representative and it can be harder. And this is in typically developing children, but at the top it says this stage occurs between 12 and 24 months of age. So that abstract symbol, and that is, they still look the same as far as under social. It just depends on what form they're using. And then for seeking additional information, we don't even get into the seeking additional information until we get to that conventional communication. This really develops between the 12 and 18 months of age. And so you'll see here, that's the answers yes, no questions, ask questions, naming things and people, makes comments. So, and these last ones, again, the concrete symbols, abstract symbols, and language, it all just depends on the form that works the best for the child and what is working for them. But we certainly want to work toward the language level, but our kids oftentimes in the concrete and the abstract, they can get their point across very clearly. So that is the communication matrix. And I believe you can print this out, and it would be a great way to share this with your service providers, whether they're birth to 3 or the school system. And then I would assume this would even be great for maybe some of our kids with severe multiple disabilities and severe intellectual disabilities that have transitioned, graduated from high school, and maybe are going into another group home, or they're going somewhere else where they may live, where they require more supervision, more strict supervision. Because again, this is for individuals that are below sort of that 24 months of age. So this might be another piece of information that would be helpful. Maybe they're going into a sheltered workshop, for example. This would be something that could be shared with those providers as well. So that is the communication matrix in a nutshell. I've gone through it pretty quickly, and I apologize for that. I am not sure how to get back to the can I just hit back, Bonnie?
Yeah, you can try that. It should take you back there.
Okay, I'll get out of it. Oops, I probably wanted to keep that up there because it's gonna. Okay, so we got through the communication matrix, and like I said, it probably went through it more quickly than what originally would be, but I wanted to make sure I had enough time. If anybody had any questions, this last page just shows some contact information, again, how to access the communication matrix online, and then my contact information. And I am happy for people to contact me about questions about the communication matrix, whether or not the child is identified with a combined vision and hearing loss. Bonnie, are there any questions? Because otherwise I could talk a little bit more about the deaf blindness part of it.
Actually, we have no questions at this time, so if you want to take a couple of minutes to do that, that would be wonderful.
Okay, so when we talk about the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project, this is a federally funded technical assistance and dissemination grant that we get through the Office of Special Ed program. And you saw in the beginning, it sort of showed that I had 2 titles. One was the Deafblind Specialist, here for the WDB TAP is what we call it. But I'm also the Deafblind Consultant for the Wisconsin Educational Services Program for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Outreach. And so both of those are part of the special education team at the Department of Public Instruction. There is never any cost for families or for schools and service providers to contact us to provide support. And when we talk about kids who are deafblind, that is a pretty heavy label for anybody to process. We tend to think of Helen Keller, no vision, no hearing. And we know that that is 2% of the population of individuals who are deafblind have no vision and no hearing. So I would say that it's safe to say that about 87% of the kids that are on our deafblind registry, we maintain a registry so that, because we have to report out to the Office for Special Ed Programs how many kids in the state of Wisconsin are identified as deafblind, their age, their grade, how much time they're spent in the classroom, how many are in early childhood, how many are in birth to 3. So we track that information. We don't share any identifying information. We don't share addresses or telephone numbers, birthdays, names. We don't share any of that kind of stuff. And so what the registry does is it helps us to track kids and find out where kids are geographically, what etiology seems to be consistent. Do we have a bigger population of an etiology? For example, Charge syndrome, if nobody's heard of Charge syndrome, is probably one of our leading causes of deafblindness. It's not as rare as people think it is, not to frighten anybody certainly, but because it's still a small number when you look at the population overall. In Wisconsin, we have about 160 children who are identified with deafblindness, and 87% of them have severe multiple disabilities, meaning they have 4 or more additional disabilities. And more often than not, for those of you out there that have children or are working with students that have severe multiple disabilities, this is sort of how we frame it. So if the child most often has a vision loss, almost always the child has some sort of a vision issue going on, whether cortical visual impairment is a really big one for us. but it really can be any vision loss that's not corrected by glasses. So just because somebody's farsighted or nearsighted, that wouldn't necessarily qualify them as an individual who is deafblind. They very rarely, when we look at that 87%, it's very rare for them to actually have a hearing loss that you could put hearing aids on, for example. What it is oftentimes these children have neurological implication. And so the brain just is not able to process auditory information. And so we need to figure out strategies that work for a child that bypasses the auditory and the visual system. And we'll use what we can, and sometimes that vision and hearing looks different on any given day. So we will use what vision and hearing we can, but we also give strategies where we don't have to rely on those two venues, two avenues to be able to get access to information. Most often our children are very tactile, which can pose challenges when people talk about children having tactile defensiveness. So there are strategies that we can implement to help sort of get over that tactile defensiveness. Oftentimes tactile defensiveness comes from other people, normally adults, that manipulate the child's hands. And so we have strategies where we don't manipulate their hands. We invite them to join them. So we talk about some of those techniques. So we do, and nationally it's about 87% have severe multiple disabilities. So we are obligated as a grant project to the Office for Special Ed Programs. It is an IDEA that we need to evaluate all suspected disabilities. So if anybody suspects that their child or a student that they're working with may meet the eligibility criteria as a student who is deafblind, they are welcome to contact us. Again, it's no cost. We work collaboratively with the Birth to 3 or with the school system. It's just nice to have everybody on the same page working together. So our referral process does include either the school or the Birth to 3, depending on the age of the child, so that as a team we can come out and provide evaluations and then provide strategies. We do not provide direct service, so I can't come in and be a service provider ongoing for a child, but I certainly can be an ongoing resource. So as questions emerge or you're looking for additional strategies, then the Deafblind Project can certainly be involved and be contacted. So I would encourage anybody, just even if you have just simple questions, you can contact me either by email or by phone. I am a statewide consultant, so sometimes email is the most efficient and most effective. I'm not always in the office to return phone calls immediately, although I would like to be, but I'm not. So that is what I think I would like to leave everybody with. Bonnie, it's still about 6 minutes short.
Well, that's fine, and at this point we don't have any other questions, but I think that if people do have questions, they have your contact information so they can follow up with that.
That sounds perfect.
Okay, great. So I'd like to definitely thank you at this time, Holly, for a wonderful presentation today. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure that those in attendance have as well. To all of you, this concludes our webinar today. We'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Wisconsin Facets has over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for 2017, and we would like to direct you to our Wisconsin Facets website calendar to register for any upcoming trainings. Please watch for the short evaluation coming your way, and I'd like to wish everybody a wonderful day. Again, Heidi, thank you for your presentation today, and goodbye, everybody. Thanks again.